and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yesterday evening, I introduced the Right to Vote Act of 2021. And this legislation would establish, for the first time ever, an affirmative right to vote in US federal statute, empowering American citizens to challenge in court any action taken by a state or local government that makes it harder to access the ballot. It's about a half century ago that Congressman John Lewis and Hosea Williams and Amelia Boynton and hundreds of others led marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, daring to demand the right to vote for Black Americans in the American South. And Congressman Lewis had his skull fractured that day for daring to demand voting rights for Black Americans in the American South. And their courage and their sacrifice paved the way for passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But still, half a century later, we see that politicians in Georgia and in states across the country are seeking to restrict access to the ballot, targeting Black voters just to gain a partisan advantage in elections. The Right to Vote Act of 2021 would establish for the first time an affirmative right to vote for US citizens in federal statute, and it would empower citizens to challenge in court provisions passed by the states that restrict ballot access, empowering citizens to force states like the state of Georgia to prove why such restrictions are necessary, what legitimate ends they serve, and that such restrictions are the least restrictive way of achieving those ends. I'm grateful to all of the civil rights and voting rights activists, organizers, and advocates who have assisted me and my team in the drafting of this legislation, and look forward to any questions.
All right, thanks very much, Senator. If you do have a question, feel free to use the raise hand function. If not, pop something into the chat and I can unmute you and call on you to ask a question. I just want to make sure, give everyone a second in case they have any questions. All right, yep, Stephen Fowler, of course, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, Senator, can you explain how this bill works with existing federal law and state laws that, there are currently 8 different lawsuits challenging Georgia's new voting law. And so how would your legislation, I guess, work in conjunction with existing processes or amplify it?
Well, here's what my bill, the Right to Vote Act of 2021, would do. It would empower citizens or civil rights or voting rights advocates to take a state government to court in the event the state enacts or implements any measure that diminishes access to the ballot. And when a citizen challenges such a state measure in court, the state would then have to demonstrate that whatever measure they've implemented that restricts access to the ballot serves some specific, important, legitimate governmental interest. And the citizen, the voter, could then further challenge the state to demonstrate not just that it serves a specific, important, legitimate interest, but that it's the least restrictive means of doing so. So this legislation builds on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to establish the first ever statutory guarantee of the right to vote in US federal statute, and to give voters the power to challenge any policy that diminishes their access to the ballot. I would also add, Stephen, that this legislation is not limited to challenges on the basis of racial discrimination. It allows voters to challenge any state policy that diminishes ballot access for US citizens, and again, force the state to prove in open court what specific important legitimate governmental interest is served by the state's policy, and that the state's policy is the least restrictive means of serving that end.